Uh, so let's see, from the beginning, there we go. Um, the title that I gave Bob was Storytelling from the Archives, but the more I thought about it and worked on it, it really should be with the archives, because without the way my work at Philly History happens is, as you may know, it's the city archives photograph collection, and there's over 110 or 20,000 images out of millions that they have in total, but over 100,000 are online, and I'm searching for examples that have a story to tell. But for the most part, they don't tell their stories. I need to go into the archives. I need to do the research to figure it out. This really is called public history. And when you look at the, I look at my career represented in a few of the books here, the most recent being a chapter in City Abandoned, with Vince Feldman. It was always about the research as well as the images. So it's Philadelphia history, but it's also in a public setting aimed at the public. And that's where, as Bob mentioned, my op-ed writing to me was really important. It sort of was a turning point for me where I realized you can actually have impact if you catch a topic at the right time and say the right things and bring the right research to it. Back in the late 80s, Eastern State Penitentiary was very much literally up for grabs. And I'm not saying that my op-ed pieces, I wrote two of them in that period, made a difference, but it was certainly part of the story. And that painting that you may have recognized, the Bendiner painting inside the Academy of Music that is in the far north, rather southwest corner of the lobby floor of the Kimmel Center, was in the late 80s taken from Philadelphia to the Bergen County Mall, where it was going to be sold as an asset left over from Gimbel's, and it was brought back. And again, I didn't do it, but it helped others too. So here's the cover of the latest book, Inside Philadelphia, which has 95 of what are now, I don't know, about 280 of my pieces, my essays that accompany pictures from the city archives. This is one I have not written about. It's by Wenzel Hess, one of my absolute favorite city photographers. Don't know much about him, but he worked from the late 20s into the 50s. And it's not too often that you see a scene like this, looking, I believe, up 12th Street, I'm sorry, north on 11th Street, from Chestnut in a rainstorm. And it just has a quality to it that my colleagues in art museums, when I used to be at the library company, was curator of photographs, it was more documentation than artistic. I look at Wenzel Hess as an artist, absolute artist, and he would take scenes like this that I'm thinking, I don't know, maybe I could do an essay on the weather, but it needs more than that. That would not do right by the photographer. So someday maybe I will figure out what to say about this one, or this one also by Wenzel Hess. And this is actually not far away from, this is 10th and Market, and the use of elements here. Now, what he was doing was documenting clutter on the sidewalk, as it were. City council was concerned about the regulation of newspaper stands and that sort of thing. So the city sent out its photographers to go document this. And here we have the fellow in that position. And a real coming of age thing for me was when my father said, here, My arm was barely long enough to reach out of the car window, but we'd get to Broad and Arch. He'd give me a nickel and he'd say, give that to the man and he'll give you a bulletin. And I thought, how will he know? And I thought that was pretty funny in retrospect. Of course, that was what he was doing there, selling bulletins for a nickel. Anyway, but you see from this, Wenzel Hess had more of an eye. He's not just photographing to get that stand and the vendor. There's a lot more going on here. From the little research I've done on Hess, here's his employee roster card. Talks about the evolution of his career. He resigned in 51. I was still in gestation at that point, but he really covered a good chunk of the 20th century. And here I have his certificate of death. That Jim Duffin, if you don't know him, one of the best researchers in the city. He's at Pan Archives. He turned this up. But there's more. And if you learn anything more about Hess, send it my way. Here's another of his. And it's an example of how I'll see something and I'll say, yeah, the Royal Theater, that's something I could write about and did. But there's more of a story here. And when I see an image that I'm interested in, and this is one of the great perks of that job, I ask Deb Boyer, who's the project manager at Philly History and has been since the blog started or the website started back in 05 or 06. And I'll say, Deb, I could use, or in an email, I could use a TIFF file. And from that, I could really look closely in. You see these gentlemen in front of that corner store. That's this area just to the left-hand side. And so there's something more to be seen and something more to be researched. What's going on here? What exactly was that storefront? Is that even relevant? Who were these guys? There's a lot more to say. And so for lack of my own abilities to do that kind of research, after all, each of these projects in writing can't take me, a month of research, and it's just not worth it for me to go out too far. Sometimes I was writing 26 a year at when they were at that pace. Actually, during COVID, they slowed down a little bit. So I will go to what books I know and what books I have and other sources. And you may know Christopher Morley's book, Travels in Philadelphia. It was reprinted about, 20 years ago. Ken Kalfas, Inga Saffron's husband, put it out in a new edition and found some additional essays for it. Morley, if you don't know him, was this incredible, when he was here in the 19 teens, was a columnist. And when he left Philadelphia for New York in 1920, a publisher collected his essays. And so in them, which are often very sometimes funny, enlightening, informative, insightful. I've always liked this line about South Street. He talks about Pine Street, where, just a few blocks away, where it looked like a place that you would hear music coming out of a first floor parlor window, and it sounded like someone just got out of the bath and was tinkling the ivories. And he said, by contrast, on South Street, the veins of life run close to the surface. And, it's code for something. And I think if for that something, you'd have to go to other books that might be more informative about South Street as a character in literature, as an element in the Philadelphia story. And you may know some of these books and not others. John Fury by Jack Dunphy is really a wonderful story about a wagon driver who would often encounter South Street, but he lives south of Washington. Anyway, so I would start with the image. I would then consider the streetscape. This one is not, to my knowledge, by Hess, but it's a detail of an image, and I always loved it because it's the city I don't know anymore. It doesn't look this way at 11th and Sansom. We don't have that kind of retail scape that there once was. And one of the things that I liked about this was the violin store in the midst of everything else. And you may know there's a really important violin store. They also sell cellos, guitars, banjos, etc., vintage instruments. And I know the owner, Fred Oster, and I wouldn't want to embarrass him or me by getting it wrong. And so I did the research, and here's the list of sources. It always ends up being more than I think I would need. And I tell my students this: you need to feel like you're drowning in order to get through to the other side. You need to do more than you expected to, and not quite know your way out. It takes time. So here's a frontal view of that store, and you see that it is Albert's violins, and this family was one of the great Philadelphia families of the violin. There were several. That store, of course, no longer exists. I worked for 17 years at the library company, and of course, the scene on Locust Street, library company being at 1314 Locust. This was the previous block, the 1200 block. And Bon Bon Club was not there when I worked there. This image is from 62. I didn't start at the library company until 77. And I remember I could get a slice of pizza there that was still around. But in any case, I learned a great deal from the journalists of the 20th century, the Inquirer, and very few others of the newspapers are online. The Library of Congress has some of the other papers, but in any case, quite a lot of action took place at the Bon Bon Club. And when Frank Rizzo came to Center City from his first job as captain in West Philadelphia, he came to the nearby police station, which I had heard about for decades and never seen a picture of it. I didn't go looking for it exactly, but if I always kind of wanted to see what did that police station where Rizzo actually became the big man before he moved up the ranks at headquarters to commissioner and then to mayor. And I heard about this because you may know my father was an antique dealer at 10th and Pine, and he of course encountered Captain Rizzo and heard many more stories that were that proved were proof of what we and everyone else was dealing with. One of the things Rizzo did, I'm sorry, going back, when he got to that station, he made it a habit of raiding the clubs along Locust Street, literally every day, sometimes twice a day. And one of the first things he made clear to other captains in the police force was, you don't get to raid Locust Street. That's my place. I'm going to take care of it. And you know that within a decade or so, he was the law and order man for President Nixon. So it was quite a story here, and seeing the building, which is now has long since been replaced by kind of 1960s row houses, not very appealing to my eye. That's what took place there. Okay, so when you see an image like this and it doesn't have much going for it, except there is a story there, it's like, okay, tell me the story. And the Inquirer, it turns out, has quite an account. Fires, of course, murders, fires, colorful crimes are always written about. You have to be careful sometimes to believe every word, but I won't read this to you. You can read it. Talking about the sad stories of the people who were trapped and died and fell and jumped and so on. This really is one of the most disastrous, deadly fires in American history in cities. Um, there are ranked list outs out there, and this one should be on it or is. It depends on which one you consult. There are other stories, and of course, if you were to go to that site today on Market Street, you would not um, see any evidence of it. There's no historical marker. There's no um, bus shelter with a image or that. This is the sort of thing that doesn't carry that way. You want to take your time and look at it and read it, and that's where it works well online, I think. Excuse me. Um, Not far from Temple is this remnant. It's not even a remnant. It's been overridden. A village that was called Cahocksink. It's not even a surviving neighborhood name anymore. That was originally the name of a creek that also no longer exists going through that area. And on North Randolph Street, just north of Cecil B. Moore, is this building, which I learned about. And I unfortunately didn't have an image. And it's one of the rare cases where the story was too good to let go. So I found this image in the city archives, which is showing this area as a part of the textile industries that were dominant. And there was more than textiles in this area. We weren't far from Stetson Hat Factory. In any case, going to the Geohistory Network, I was able to find this hexamer study survey, and there's the Randolph Mill. And I learned from the newspaper accounts of what took place there that the owners had locked the doors and during a night shift. Well, they didn't want the men, they claimed later in court, they didn't want the men slipping out and going around the corner to get a drink. Actually, around the corner was, what was it, St. Benjamin Brewery, which unfortunately closed. That was not there then, but you get the idea. In 1881, a really terrible fire took place there. And the newspapers, of course, carried it and the trial afterward and so on. I learned about girls who would hold hands and jump from a window. There was no fire escape. There were fire escape laws, but they weren't enforced. And even for that matter, in Philadelphia public schools, they weren't enforced for. So this fire resulted in a study done by the Franklin Institute that resulted in a better understanding of what a useful fire escape would be. And that would be a fire tower, very much like we still have. So it's a dramatic story in and of itself, but it also had very important results. That building is still there, of course, and not marked. Here's one of the colorful and sad images. George Matheson recognizing the polka dot dress of his 15-year-old daughter, Mary. And shortly after the fire, they retrieved her remains and took them to their home, the Matheson home. And the owner of the factory, Landenberger, shows up, and he wanted to check out the body because they thought maybe it's Annie Straub, who was also missing. And it's, and the father tells the reporter that he might have come to see the family as any gentleman would have done. He was not paying respects or sympathy, or he was just checking out, taking a toll there, and sad stuff. So Philadelphia offers all kinds of opportunities for stories. And, I look at something like this as low-hanging fruit. It was so written about and has been so often. So what can we do to get it to speak in a new way to us? We have the opportunity of connecting it with something like the pop artist from 1960s and 70s. He's still alive, so far as I know, Claes Oldenburg. And when I read his manifesto from 1961 called I Am for Art, and every point in it, it's really good reading. You could find it online. I'm for art that's flipped on and off with a switch. I'm for the blinking arts, lighting up the night. This is great stuff. And, not too long ago, an artist who did, not from Philadelphia, did a visual, virtual reality project with a Liberty Bell on the steps of the Art Museum, floating in the air. And I have to admit, I'm on the full disclosure. I'm on the board of the Association for Public Art, and when, not that it was their project, but I made the point that that artist seemed to be either aware of or not aware of this depiction of the Liberty Bell from 1926, and I'm and she wasn't, and that was very disappointing to me. It's the responsibility, I think, of artists, of public artists, to do the research, and you can't miss something like this, So, what could that project of hers in 2020 or 2019 have been? I think it could have been something more informed than it was. And I think that doing having historical research should be done for every project, because we're in a city that is so filled with history. You can't just turn your back on it. It's there whether you like it or not. Here's another example. I knew this story before I encountered this photograph back in the 70s when I was doing research on the evolution of public architecture. And the statue of Demeter, the actual ancient Greek statue, was placed at first in the garden when the Academy of Fine Arts was at 10th and Chestnut, but then Frank Furness, and we don't know exactly how the decision came about to place it, to place this statue, this headless, armless statue. The donor, Commodore Patterson, tried to buy the head, but he just couldn't afford it. But his men got this. They claimed they paid for it, and put it on the ship and brought it back to Philadelphia, and of course gave it a home. So in the 1940s, during the war, World War II, an archaeologist in New York at Columbia could not go on his digs in Europe and the Middle East, and so he went around the United States trying to visit examples of ancient sculpture that he had heard about, read about, seen pictures of, and he knew about this one. That's about, it had already been in Philadelphia for more than 100 years at that point. He gets to Philadelphia to learn that it has been broken apart, taken down, and pieces of it are in storage. And that's the best we could do. The way this came about was in the Depression, just a few years before this archaeologist went on his hunt, he the board members of the academy thought that it seemed to be cracking, maybe perhaps threatening to fall, and they got a price to take it down, and it was too expensive. It was a rigger, would probably put up a full scaffolding and bring it down. I don't know how to do that, but there's a right way and a wrong way. They couldn't afford the right way. They got a second price, still too expensive. They got a third price, a guy with a ladder and a hammer. And so there we go. If there's an upside to this story, it's that Charles Rudy, a sculptor on staff at the Academy of Fine Arts, took a few of those pieces from storage. And you see it, they describe on their website, Pentelic marble. That is the actual real thing from ancient Greek statuary. And it was accessioned in 1942. So it didn't stay in storage long, did it? Wonder if the archaeologist got to see it. So that's the kind of story that you find the picture later, and luckily this picture was available, and I could then put that out there. You may know and have even visited the Logan Triangle, and I was just delighted. This is a place, for those of you who don't know, where there were, I don't know how many, 1,000 homes, mostly row homes, that were gradually sinking, and there were, excuse me, there were gas explosions and fires and actual casualties, and it became a real issue. And what it was discovered, the engineers discovered that the fill of this land, it was originally a creek, kind of like maybe 30, 40 feet lower than the grade of other adjacent streets. And so the city got a contract put out and got folks to do the landfill, and there wasn't actual landfill that they were using. It was trash and ash, and it was unstable. This is what it looks like from above today. It really hasn't been mitigated, and it's been more than 20 years since these 1,000 row houses have been vacated and demolished. It really is a tremendous challenge in urban design. And there are lots of stories, I think, that have come out about people who have lived through this. But what we don't know, because it's so long ago, are the stories from how it got filled. Excuse me. The area of 7th and Cortlandt actually is a little bit to the southeast of the area torn down. So in fact, if we were to go back to this slide, there's a great deal more than that. You see these buildings on the south side of the Roosevelt Boulevard. That's about where 7th and Cortlandt is. Let's take a look. You see this feature. And you say, what is that? It looks like a chimney. It's actually a manhole with a manhole cover at the top. That's how high they were going to fill this whole area while they placed the stream in this underground culvert, the Winghahawking, which, by the way, if they had let it survive, would probably be as beautiful as the Pennypack or the Wissahickon. But the idea was to extend the city grid as far as it would go in every direction. And the creek was just merely in the way. And there was not an appetite for parkland at that point. Other stories. I know that Hidden City, I think, has done recently something on the ladies' entrance. And on the right-hand side here, you see a neighborhood saloon with a ladies' entrance. There were many. You see other features, the typography on the door and the swinging gates at the entrance, and of course the men and the officers. Um, and I thought this is a good one. There are several good ones in the collection. And there is this thing with the American saloon in that period of time and the gender stories that go along with it. You may know this image, painting by John Sloan of McSorley's Bar, which is still in Lower Manhattan. The paintings at the Detroit Institute, it's really one of their treasures. They do have some. And I thought, wait a minute, John Sloan was from Philadelphia. He learned about bars in his time in Philadelphia. So where did he live and where did he drink before, at the age of, I think, 31, he moved to New York? He was also an illustrator for the daily newspapers, I think the Inquirer and one or two of the others, he and the other members of the Ashcan School. So I did a little research and found that he lived at 1921 North Camac Street. If you were to look at that site today, it's like right across from Old Paley Library on the Temple campus. And that not too far away was one of the neighborhood bars at the corner of 9th and Berks. So I thought, okay, he must have spent some time there, and or maybe not, maybe some other, but that's the one I found. And there, lo and behold, is the illustration to go along with that story. And you see it's just another version of that Shackamaxon bar where you have the man glaring territorially at the photographer who's just doing his job documenting some street work. I wish Dennis Clark was still with us. He died a while ago, but I still miss him. He wrote about Rittenhouse Square and the Irish American neighborhood of Ramcat, which isn't a term you see very, very often, but I thought it's an interesting dynamic that he carried forth in that chapter. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to do some digging down there, and I find that Devil's Pocket, which is really just a little triangle of space just to the south or southwest of the Naval Asylum, the Naval Home, now a Toll Brothers project, And I found this image from 1919. And because as I mentioned, that you can get a TIFF file, I got one, and I'm able to not only see the detail, but I'm able to see the graffiti on the wall, which mentions the Kaiser and unfortunately someone in the neighborhood. None of my business what happened with Rose, but there you go. And that is not too far from the site of where Adela Bond lived or moved into on the 2900 block of Ellsworth Street. Her story is quite a good one. The more I did research on it, the more, and I found that it was written about, but only barely, like Murray Dubin mentioned it in his book on the Mummers, I think, or South Philadelphia. Anyway, Adela Bond was a municipal court employee, an African-American woman who bought this house, which is no longer there. The street is long since decimated of houses. And she became the flashpoint for the race riots of 1918. The Philadelphia Tribune, which thank goodness is online, at least a large portion of it. There's a full standing picture of her there. I figure, someday somebody's gonna take that picture, the only one we know of her, and make a mural. I mean, the public memory is really lacking, as you can see. But this title is great. Lone woman holds a mob of 500 white brutes at bay. The account of this was written about just a few months later by a very memorable founder of the NAACP, Walter White. Memorable because we've heard that name elsewhere. This Walter White was famous in his own right. And he wrote an 8-page account, which is good that he wrote it. And then in 1975, Vincent Franklin wrote in Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography. But I turned to the newspapers, and what I could find turned up all kinds of stories, which you see in the context of World War I happening here. You go to the jump page and you see there was a photograph of a crowd on Sunday, July 28th, which was the previous Wednesday is when Adela Bond had moved in. The riots were going on day after day, night after night. This is all sort of, we know of this intersection. So I took the facts that were known from the newspaper stories, and sometimes you can't entirely trust the addresses, but the red circles are where action occurred, an incident occurred, and the blue are where people lived. And you can see the way this really consumed the neighborhood. In fact, it went beyond the immediate neighborhood. The police station at 20th and Federal, a police station is there to this day. It's a different building, been replaced. But that's where one of the officers, Robert Ramsey, shot Riley Bullock, a black man, in the back, surrounded by other officers who did not testify against him. He spent a few months, maybe not much more than that, in prison. Riley Bullock, a 37-year-old, 38-year-old black man, was killed very quickly. And as we know, this is a story that continues to this day. And I recently was interviewed about this riot by a reporter from CNN, and she said at the end of the interview, "Is there anything else you want me to know?" And I said, "I'm just glad I got to bring Riley Bullock's name forward again." His house turns out survives. That lot next to it has been developed by now, and I was able to do a Jane's walk a year and a half ago, and we stood out in front of the house, and it really literally anchors, as you all know, anchors the experience of seeing a city. Not far away is this building no longer survives at all, the health centers of Philadelphia. And it's rare in the City Archives collection to have an image with a lot of people. Some people sometimes, but certainly a crowd like this. This is part of the story, the success of these public health centers, which started out, I learned from the research, started out in 1913, became institutionalized in 1916, and then proliferated to a point where I think by this period, there were about 8 of them. And Health Center number 2 has this lovely picture where you can see an awful lot going on with mothers, grandmothers, children, the American flag in a few places, and there's an education center. There was a feeling that half of the infant deaths in the first year of life could be avoided by educating the families, in particular, according to the literature, the mothers. And there was the equivalent of a nonprofit group called the Child Federation that took the advanced thinking of some doctors and nurses to bring healthcare into the communities, which was an innovative, if not revolutionary, idea. The Child Federation put together this experiment, but they also wrote about it, knowing that this was a national story. And in fact, their first experimental health center was probably, if it was the second, if not the first in the nation of its type. I find it interesting that the frontispiece in one of their, they did 3 of these yearbooks. They're very small and they're all available at Google Books, where they put the caption, cringeworthy, I think, our problem of a teenage girl with an infant. And it says courtesy of North American. That was the name of one of the dailies. The purpose of these centers was education about health, maternal health, the health of the child in gestation, prenatal health. There were examinations, there were surveys done of the community. And on the roof of this building, they made it into a garden area and noted that this is the health center that I'll show you in the next slide at 12th and Carpenter, where the proximity, they say in this annual report, to several large factories. 12th and Carpenter, there were a lot of factories on Washington Avenue with probably thousands of employees at that point, where these young women would come and have their lunch hour in the roof garden of this health center. And the objective was to get them to be more familiar with issues of family health and maternal health and infant health. And as a result, there was a real positive impact on in the decline of infant mortality. I'm happy to say that the City Archives has this image on the right, and you see Health Center number 1. That was there, it's photographed in 1953, but this was the place that was opened. And you see here in the first yearbook of the Child Federation from 1913, it's the same building. And on the roof, you can see the distinctive roof garden. Well, I don't know if anyone follows me on Facebook or Twitter, but I have been working on this, and I didn't want to tip my hand on Facebook because I'm about to finish my piece on it. But it was essential for me to know whether or not this survived to this day. And I have to say, many other of the buildings don't survive. That one on Point Breeze is gone. There's one up in Kensington area that's not there. There were several that are gone, and it's especially great to have the first one, the one that literally was the model that created news. And the fact that it's not known today, to my knowledge, if you know that it's known, I'd love to hear that. But and so I put a picture of it from Google Street View just 2 days ago, right? Or yesterday? Anyway, and yeah, today's the 10th. And Don Groff, who was, I think he's retired from the Daily News, posted this picture. So, yay, it's still there. I mean, sometimes you look at a Google Street View image and it's 2 or 3 years old, and I didn't know what the deal would be. So anyway, happy to say that it's there. And I will post my story. And I just hope that the people who care about such things, the preservation of buildings, the designation of historic sites, whatever, let them do their thing. We now have another vestige of Philadelphia history to celebrate, to worry about, to help interpret the past and the present. And if anything is in the news now, it's public health. This place was designed for that, and the literature around it is really wonderful. So Dr. Cruson, who gets a bad name for not having canceled the parade in 1918 that led to Philadelphia's leading the way with epidemic deaths in the flu epidemic of that year, he also was responsible for the proliferation of something good, and that was these health centers in communities.